quickly just add in a few things. I was born 68 years ago Monday, Halloween. My parents were married for a very short period of time, and unfortunately it didn't last. And I ended up moving with my mom and my maternal grandparents to San Diego and grew up there and went to school down there. But I always wanted to come back to the area. And when I somehow got into Stanford, that put me very close and reestablished my ties to come home every weekend I could, and always wanted to come back here. And so after a fairly brief career in the Sweetwater District as a teacher and then a dean of students and assistant principal down there, I applied back in the area and was a finalist for 2 positions, Morro Bay High School principal and Templeton High School principal. And I finished second for Morro Bay, which turned out to be an absolute blessing because I came to Templeton and it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. Not just because of my experience in Templeton, but on the school board at the time in Templeton was Kate. And the plan had been for my first wife, Rosa, and the mother of my 2 boys, Ted and Tim, to move up with me the following year. And she changed her mind and said, I'm going to stay in San Diego and be closer to my family. Wasn't a complete shock, but nevertheless, it was like, what do I do now? I'd moved up, my kids had moved up, yikes. And Kate was on the school board and came to me and said, boy, we really don't want another change here. Is there anything I could do to change your mind? So we got married. She said it was her civic duty. But anyway, that's a little bit of my background there. I had a fabulous time at Templeton. So many fond memories of everything there as we grew into a really remarkable school district, I think. And I'll speak about that a little bit later. But enough about me. It did help me quite a bit, I have to say, in Templeton, at the time that Templeton was changing so rapidly, to be able to relate, I think, both to the old-timers and the sort of nouveau riche of Templeton, so that somebody could come in and say, well, I don't know what you think you know about here. My family moved here in 1923. And I'll say, well, my family moved here in 1882. So, take the upper Asia 5. And then, of course, having the Stanford background helped with some of the people that would come in and suggest that maybe we didn't know what we were doing, and to say, well, yeah, I do have an education here, and perhaps I do know what I'm doing. So anyway, it was a fantastic run. We'll always have nothing but the fondest of memories for Templeton. And of course, that has been carried on with my 2 grandchildren up here, Raymond and Elizabeth, going to Templeton schools, and my son, Ted, for reasons that escape him and me at times, is not here this evening because he's on the school board here in Templeton, as you may know. So I still have a lot of ties to Templeton. What I have planned this evening is not really formal. It's sort of chronological based on various topics, but I'm skipping around a lot because anecdotes will come to mind and things like that. Let me state up front that what I'm reporting to you is family history as it was told to me, undoubtedly embellished and changed based on this, that, or the other thing. So if you're sitting in the audience and you say, boy, that's not the way I remember that happening, could be, and feel at ease to raise your hand and say, I think that happened maybe differently, or at least my family said it happened differently, or whatever. I won't be offended by that. There will be an opportunity at the end for questions, but at any point during it, feel free to interrupt. So, basic agenda. Early days back through the 1860s, a lot of what I have to say about that time period I learned from Dan Krieger. I hope all of you know Dan Krieger or know of him, professor of history emeritus, and had for a long time a Sunday column in the Telegram Tribune. We've become very good friends with the Kriegers. Dan and his wife Liz are fantastic people, and every summer they come out to our winery in Adelaide and do a history of Adelaide presentation. And he's very familiar with the Saline Indians and the history, so he's the source of an awful lot of the information I have to share. The early days, if you'd go on to the next slide, please. Early days, Saline Indians and shepherds in Cinnabar. You probably know that one of the ways that they looked for cinnabar was because it was a reddish color. Cinnabar is the ore from which mercury is refined, and it's very, very red. And the Indians, as you knew, like to have dyes, and so settlers would go, or prospectors would go to the Indians and ask them where they got that dye, and then look for cinnabar. The other thing that Dan Krieger turned me on to was how frequently shepherds and herdsmen were the real prospectors. And a little known fact that he shared with me, not so much here, but over in the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains, a lot of the original gold mines and silver mines were financed by Basque banks, because the Basque shepherds were told what to look for as they took the sheep up into the highlands, up into the high country for the summer. And so they would point the prospectors in the right direction. So anyway, if you don't know about mercury, it was a very, very valuable mineral for two primary purposes. One was in the separation of gold and silver from the original ore. So that was a big use for it. And of course, with the gold rush and everything, that it became almost as valuable as gold. Also, it was used in munitions. And so something that Dan shared with me that I didn't know was that if you go like to Civil War battlefields like Gettysburg, that there's still traces of mercury there from the munitions. My first memory of mercury growing up was in the early 1960s when I would go down to the Buena Vista mine. I'll get to this in a little bit. It was full-on production for the war in Vietnam, and was an EPA super site. Later we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll also want to talk a little bit about Desperados, the county seat, or whatever the court jurisdiction. The Justice of the Peace was in San Miguel, and I've looked in San Miguel at the records for Adelaide, and it's everything from stole a chicken to shot a man. Lots of stuff was going on, and a lot of people don't realize what a populated place Adelaide was back in those days. Another issue about, or thing to mention about Desperados that Dan shared with us was it was very, very common to drive herds from here all the way to Stockton and sell the stock there to the stockyards that were supplying the gold miners in the Sierras. And on the way back, desperados, outlaws, whatever, were known to intercept and rob the shepherds and herders as they came back with their gold or money from that. Another thing that he mentioned that people forget, we talk about the drought now, back in the 1860s, there was a huge flood that about wiped out everything in the Central Valley, completely flooded the Central Valley, and then there was a drought. It didn't rain at all. And here on the Central Coast during that drought, Dan told stories and had reports from the Telegram Tribune back then of the stench in the air from the rotting livestock everywhere because they didn't have reservoirs and they didn't have wells, and so everything died. Another thing I'll mention about the livestock is that the primary purpose of the beef wasn't for meat necessarily, it was for the hides. Because the hides, and that was part of Adelaide, was a route over the hill to Cayucas, and it was when whaling was kind of falling out of favor, and it was very common to take the hides, take them into the saltwater in the ocean, cure them there, put them on the beach, and then they would take the harpoons from the whaling ships, shoot them down through the stacks of hides, cinch them down, and then ship them to the East Coast and England. Anybody know for what purpose? To be made into conveyor belts for the Industrial Revolution. That was the primary purpose of those. But there was a huge drought at the time. And remember, this was before, there hadn't for a long time been much in the way of cattle or sheep here. The main source of protein in those days was bears. There was a lot of bears, los osos, etc. And shooting deer. But one thing to know about that, a lot of people think, well, back in that day there must have been lots of deer. If you know anything about it, you know that there's more deer now than there ever were back in the day because they have more to eat from the crops. Back in the day, it was really unusual to see a buck. And it was kind of a big deal to get one. And I remember my dad telling me that his Uncle Frank, who had the old ranch up on the Coast Range that we unfortunately lost through a divorce and whatnot, that he informed the game warden at the time that he could do what he wanted to, but from as far as you could see in that direction, and as far as you could see in that direction, deer season never closed here and there was nothing you could do about it. So that was kind of the wild, wild west at the time. If you needed a deer, you shot one, and nobody should complain about it. The other thing, I was going to mention it later, but now's a good time to mention as well. My family was Roman Catholic, and so with Fridays and with Lent, there was a big need for fish. And so whenever there was a low tide, we would go over to Morro Strand and clam. At the time, clams were really plentiful there. Or we'd go up by Cayucas and get abalone, or go up on the coast and get bullhead off the rocks. And that was also that on Fridays we could have fish, and all during Lent. So a little more history about protein there. Mercury and cinnabar. A little bit I'll get to about my family history and that it was the Dubost mine before it was the Clough mine. But a little bit more about mercury and cinnabar. The Clough mine is pretty much gone now, if you've been out there. And even when I was little, it was mostly gone. My dad told me, and I've never seen any of the records, maybe some of you know about it, but he said that buried in that mine were like 185 Italian immigrants who were working that caved in. And before OSHA and everything, it was just nothing said about it, just left it the way it was, and that was it. It was a huge mine. I'll show some pictures of it later. When I was growing up, though, it was the Buena Vista mine, operated by Harold Biagini. That was the big mine out there, and it was going full bore for the war in Vietnam, meaning like 24/7. And my dad would go down to the mine every night to visit with his best friend, Errol Dodd. You'll see pictures of them when they were in grade school later on in the presentation. But we would go down there, and he would visit with Errol and tell stories. And I would literally play with the mercury. If you remember, the mine was open pit. There was a big crusher that made big rocks into smaller rocks, and the smaller crusher that made it into powder, and then it dropped down a chute, and it was just this big, not much bigger than this table here, that came down as powder, and you just raked it back and forth, and the beads of mercury would bead up and fall down into the lead flask or whatever that they were transported in. But that entire area out there was a moonscape because the smelt was going the entire time. And those beautiful mountains, if you go up over Cypress Mountain there, road, not anything green whatsoever. The emissions from the mine were really, really bad. Speaking of pollution, again, most of that was for the war in Vietnam. And I have it's funny how things stick in your memory. I remember being at the house, and we're sort of at the top of the grade, coming from where the Clough mine is and the Buena Vista mine is, back up to Adelaide Road. And I remember hearing the old trucks just strain to get up the hill that had only like one layer of those old iron flasks that were filled with mercury because it was so heavy. But I remember them going up, and it was very valuable, and it was also for the war effort. So at the time, I'm sure Harold thought that he was doing a great thing, and of course he ended up later on being sued by the EPA as a super site and all that kind of stuff, which leads to my next little anecdote. There was a lot of pollution from it. Growing up though, I frequently was covered in red dust, and not from being down at the mine, but because that's what everybody used for gravel. You could get gravel delivered to your driveway, whatever, from the mine. And so if there had been a recent delivery, there was just red dust as you drove up our driveway and where we played basketball and whatnot, you'd come in covered in red dust. That was from the cinnabar that was still in the slag from the mine. A really interesting story though about that, I think that will fascinate you, is that way later in life, it must have been, how many years ago? Mid-1990s or so, Harold was being sued by the EPA as it being a super site, and his attorney,
my sister
is an outlaw of ours, in-law, whatever. And she realized that we had that background and asked me if she could interview my father about those days. And if you remember, if you're familiar at all with Adelaide, you may remember that the road that is now paved that went from where it cuts up over to 7X and up over Cypress Mountain on around to Las Tablas Fire Station was just gravel. That's all it was. Yeah? And we've been after them forever, after the county. When are you going to pay this? When are you going to pay this? When are you going to pay this? A little background there. So anyway, we're in our house here in Templeton, over on Condor Lane, and Shauna is interviewing my dad, kind of taking his deposition about when he worked at the mine and what went on there. And he starts telling her about how not only did the gravel for anybody who wanted to go into your driveway like it did for us, but the county took that slag and put it as the road base for that road and every other road around. Which of course Shauna then suggested to the county, perhaps it's not Harold that distributed this, but you guys did as road base.
Well, she was his attorney.
She was his attorney, that's what I'm saying, for Harold.
Yeah.
Well, miraculously, that road was paved about 2 weeks later and has been kept paved ever since. So a little background on that. I will say, as I was saying, visiting earlier with people, that I played with it all the time. My dad worked in it. He worked down there part-time, and He lived into his 90s. So
With
I
most
know
of his
that's,
teeth.
yeah, all his teeth, more than I have right now. But anyway, it's a little, just a wonder about that. Anyway, this was the clown mine. It looks like the Buena Vista that I remember. All this was gone before I have any memories whatsoever. It's just, if you go past the Buena Vista, you get up over the top and you turn to the right a little bit. It's over to the right there. Right to the left, if you go up that road where some of the mine shafts are still open there. So as I said, my family did not start the clown mine. They bought it and developed it, and then they decided early on, wisely I think, that you could make more money supplying miners than being a miner. And so they sold out to Clow, and I'm sure glad that they did. During this time, though, there was a real population explosion in Adelaide. There were homesteads everywhere. And if you're out there and somebody will say to you, oh, that old spring was down on the Coppic, or it was on the Myers, or on the Norman. Well, those are the names of the original homesteaders that went with that 80-acre parcel. There were also a huge Mennonite congregation in Adelaide, the Bergmans, the Weebies, the Clausens, Hams, et al., Anabaptists, if I recall, who had been persecuted in, I think, what's now Ukraine, in Russia, and so ended up coming to America, and then a significant that's still here today with some very familiar names, but a lot of Mennonites. A lot of miners. There was a little bit of gold originally, but that didn't pan out, and silver mining, but it was primarily mercury and for the refinement of gold and silver, also used in munitions. And interestingly enough, the first insane asylum in the western United States, I believe, if not in California, was up in Stockton, because it was that's where Mad Hatter came from, is from mercury poisoning from working in it and ending up in an asylum. Trade and transport through the area was huge, because that was a primary means by which one got from Paso or from San Miguel over to the coast. It was long before the railroad here, and Adelaide at that time had a very significant population. So anyway, my family decided that the thing to do was to open a store and a post office. There was one existing that they purchased and ran the post office till 1936, I think it was, and the Adelaide store for quite some time. There was also a dance hall there, and it was really the community center at that time. If you're out there, you'll see a historical marker where unfortunately our family home was, that has been sold out to the billionaires, like everything else in Adelaide is being sold.
I just want to say something about the dance hall. Curt's father, for any of you that knew Ray Dubost, he was so charming, but I remember him telling me that as a young boy, he always loved the smell of coffee, because as his mom, as they were getting ready for the Saturday night dances, his mom would start the coffee pot, and he would lay in bed in his house next to the dance hall and smell that coffee. I always thought that was the sweetest memory.
He also told me that if you ever wanted to find old bottles or whatever, to go out to the outhouse, and if anybody wanted to do the mining there, that they would find quite a few antique bottles and whatnot. But as I said, they opened the Adelaide store and post office. I'll tell a little more history of the family when we get to that slide. But it was a 2-day trip over, and we still have the spring wagon there at our winery, in addition to the first motorized vehicle on the ranch, the 37 Ford pickup that was his line truck for the Adelaide Rural Telephone Company, and the 55 Ford that he drove until he died, and the old Army truck that was used to pull a lot of the stumps on the property is right there at our winery still. But they would make the 2-day trip over to Cayucas, and if you remember, anybody remember on Old Creek, where it gets really, really windy at the top before it drops down toward Whale Rock, there used to be a hairpin turn, and there was a cement trough there and a spring at the side of the road. It was there until that big earthquake in '03 completely changed. If you know anything about springs with big earthquakes, new ones spring up and other ones disappear. But that's where they stopped for lunch. They would leave Adelaide with the team of mules and the spring wagon that's still out there in Adelaide on display, and make the trip over. They'd stop there for lunch, coming and going to water the horses, and then going over to the Cayucas store, meet the clipper ship, and get supplies in the mail. I'll speak about that a little bit later. That all kind of came to an end when Pastorals got the train in '86. Dubost family history. I've got to go back a little bit in European history here. You may recall that the first European country to sort of unify, going all the way back, I think, to the 1200s in Charlemagne, was France. And that made France the dominant power in Europe for a long, long time. That all changed in 1871. You remember your European history? Franco-Prussian War. Otto von Bismarck started unifying Germany, and all of the various areas of Germany and Prussia got together, and there was a huge war that France was overwhelmed, Paris was taken, and I had two relatives in the artillery who were severely, severely wounded. And whoever it would have been, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, whatever, presciently said to everybody, I don't think this is going to be the last war we have with the Germans. We might want to go someplace else. Well, they were blacksmiths and miners by trade, and of all places to go, Auguste took an exploratory trip over, and they went to the Black Hills of South Dakota for the mining. And again, they were trying to avoid war. What happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota around 1877? A fellow by the name of Custer, you may remember. And so they skedaddled out of there, and they went to Hawaii, then known as the Sandwich Islands, and they were blacksmiths for the royal family. In fact, I remember vaguely from my youth an old picture of an outrigger canoe at what's now, what's the Waikiki, with them there, dressed in pioneer clothes from here, so it kind of looks out of place. But that's when they were the blacksmiths for the royal family. They heard, though, about Cinnabar here on the coast, and so they took a ship to Cayucas. They landed in Cayucas, and they were waiting for some of the money to come from France from still disposing of the family estate back there. There's still a lot of family back there. Hadn't come yet. So they went to the hotel and store there in Cayucas, which is still there, and they asked for credit. Well, the guy that ran the store did not like Frenchmen. I don't know if it was something because of his Prussian background or what, but he wouldn't give me credit. And so they made the trip up over here into Adelaide, lived on beans, I'm sure, for an awful long time until they made their fortune and went back and bought the place and fired the guy that wouldn't give them. And for a long time, when they went over there, they were going for their own store and staying at the hotel that they owned. Let's see, Sherbrooke to South Dakota to Hawaii to Cayucas. As I said early on, although they provided rations and everything to the miners, they got out of the mining business. They took over a store that was already existing and a post office that was already existing. You'll see, and I remember from when I was little, the store was gone, but that's a vineyard on the hill behind the house. And there was no deer fence, and as I said, at the time there weren't that many deer, so they got plenty of grapes, and they made their own wine all the way through Prohibition and everything, and had it down in the cellar. But I guess they were most known, my great uncle Frank in particular, for making apricot brandy. Was their real specialty. And I do remember as a kid when my grandmother would send me to pick fruit, she'd always say if she's making jam or something, she said, I don't want the ones that look good. I want the bird-pecked ones. The bird-pecked ones are the sweetest ones. That's what will make the best preserves. And so I'd go off to find the apricots that could be made into brandy or into pies and whatnot. My family, in addition to the store and post office, they were dryland farmers. My dad farmed barley and wheat for an extended period of time. Although he was never really one to want to be a farmer. He kind of wanted to do things that were more mechanical. And so I did want to mention that one of his side jobs was drilling tree holes. He had an old Ford tractor, and he and his 55 Ford would go around to the various places, and almost all of the old almond and walnut orchards in the North County were drilled by my dad. And my dad was old school, and so he was always going for a record of how many holes can I get dug in a certain period of time. And I remember out on Oak Flat, he did one that he was so proud of, and I said to him at the time, I'm glad you're proud of that, but did you even make enough money to pay for your gas to come over here because you did it so fast? But he was that kind of a guy. We did run some sheep and cattle. He was like the last sheep person I think left in Adelaide at the time, but he raised sheep all the way through. I could remember, and I brought some sheep back when I came back to the area in 1987. Skip back one just briefly. The other thing that they did, and we'll get to this later in more detail, is they operated the Adelaide Rural Telephone Company from 1908 to 1960. And it's really an incredible story if you think about it, how recently ago that is. It's just over 100 years ago, but there was no communication to Adelaide whatsoever. And when we get to the family portion of this, I'll tell you the story of my great aunt Natalia, who at a rather old age, I guess, in those days, in her late 20s, got married and went to Los Angeles on her honeymoon and died of pneumonia on her honeymoon. Before penicillin and everything, you could get sick and not recover. And they didn't even know she was sick. And so that's when they put in the phone company so that they could have some contact with the rest of the world. And I brought some memorabilia from that to show you. And that's one of the original shares of the Adelaide Rural Phone Company replica there with Pauline Dodd's 65 shares signed by my dad, Raymond Dubost there. Grain harvesting was a big deal. I don't remember, I could not have seen this, but I remember a lot of the old steam engines and old engines that they had. Unfortunately, in the 1940s, almost all of that was sold for scrap for the war effort. So all of that went away. But my memories of grain harvesting early in my life, they didn't have the pusher harvesters, then they were all puller harvesters. And so you had one guy driving the track layer in front that was pulling the harvester behind, and they were pretty expensive. So my dad owned one with Marion Davis. They shared it. Marion Davis would drive the tractor, and my dad would be up on the harvester, keeping the header balanced so that it would get the grain. But it was really a difficult process, and I don't think anybody raises grain around here anymore because you couldn't even make your diesel bill anymore doing it. But anyway, that's the old operation there. This is my family. This is Auguste, and we have a wine at the winery named for Auguste. Remarkable man, absolutely remarkable man. Apparently could do darn near anything. And this is my great-grandmother, Pauline. That's my great-uncle, Frank. That's my great-aunt, Natalia, in the middle that I just mentioned. And then that's my grandfather, Alfred. And if you just look at them, and you see the two of them, and you see my grandfather, he looks a little more reserved and whatnot. Apparently he was not very social, not one like his brother to really get out and do things. And so, as was the case a lot in those days, there weren't a lot of available women, and he couldn't find a wife. And so they sent to France a telegram and said to his cousin Alexandrine, "You're 15 now, you're moving to California to marry your cousin."
Oh, wow.
And that's my grandmother, who in large part raised me, Alexandrine. Remarkable, remarkable woman. She had 5 children, all through a midwife. The last were twins, my Uncle Fred and my Uncle Mo. Maurice Dubost, some of you may remember from working at Crocker Bank and was very active in the Catholic Church and whatnot in Paso Robles. But they were born at the ranch with a midwife, and between the two of them, weighed almost 18 pounds. Yeah, that was Alexandria. Tough times there. And that's one of the first vehicles on the ranch there. I do remember seeing that as a kid. I don't know what happened to that.
The postcard.
Pardon me?
The postcard.
Oh, yeah. We can.
Do you want
Let's come back to that. You remind me though. Go to the next slide. This is a bit of a family tree. I should have included Alexandria in here, but I was just going by what came out of the definitive book on Adelaide. If you don't know, is Fraser McGilvery's History of Adelaide here, which is the source of some of these pictures. But again, they had 3 children, Natalia, Alfred, and Frank. As you can see, as I mentioned, Natalia died in 1908 on her honeymoon, and that was the start of the Adelaide Rural Telephone Company that went until 1960. My grandfather, Alfred, and then Frank. And Frank operated the big ranch, the Bellevue Ranch up on the hill. Alfred and my grandmother, again, had 5 kids. My Uncle Frank, who moved to San Francisco and worked for PG&E. My dad, Raymond, who spent his entire life here on the ranch. My Aunt Ann Thorpe, if you remember Don Thorpe, Ann Thorpe, Thorpe Laboratories in Paso Robles. And then the twins who had no children. And then in the rest of the family tree, Frank and my cousin Carol and cousin Ed, both still alive in the Bay Area. I was the only child there, and then Ann and Don had Dennis and Richard. And if you follow down from there, Tim, who lives down in San Clemente, and my other son Ted, who lives here in Templeton, is on the school board, and Raymond and Elizabeth. So I bring this up because, as you can see, that's 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 6th generation on the same piece of property, which is something we're awfully proud of.
Absolutely.
Let's see.